A common question that I hear about Archer and Olive notebooks is, can you use fountain pens and fountain pen ink inside of the notebook when you're using it as a bullet journal? There aren't any straightforward answers to this question, so the best thing to do is do some pen tests, do some ink swatches, and see what holds up. Every ink has a different quality. Some are drier and wetter than others. Additional shimmers and sheens on top of that ink can affect the pages in different ways. I've been bullet journaling for 6 years, having used Leuchtturm notebooks, Exceed brand from Walmart. But what about Archer and Olive notebooks? 160 GSM paper is much thicker than anything else that I've used before. The paper is uncoated, so you're not going to get any of that ink laying on top. However, different types of ink will react differently. In today's video, I want to show you a bunch of different pens and ink and show you how they react inside of the Archer and Olive notebooks. We'll be using glass dip pens today, metal dip pens, calligraphy nibs, as well as a few other fountain pens to show you what different nib sizes look like and react inside of the notebook. When it comes down to ink, I've pulled out a lot of different types of ink. We've got Colorverse, Pelikan, Conklin, Ferris Wheel Press, Monteverde USA, Platinum, Lavenger, and a few others as well. When it comes to fountain pens, the nib size really does matter. Nib sizes that are extra fine are going to put down a lot less ink than fountain pens that are broad or even have a stub nib. But along with that, the type of ink that you have inside of your pen is also going to make a difference. This is my Twsbi Vac Mini with a broad nib, so a lot more bold. And I currently have this filled with my Birmingham Pen Company's electric patina, a beautiful blue-black mix. I want to start here because more than likely you'll be using a fountain pen with some type of a nib inside of your Archer and Olive notebooks. So it's important to see how they do. So this ink tends to be a little bit more wet. It doesn't dry instantly. It sits on top of the paper for a second before it soaks in. I'll also be doing some ink time videos as well throughout this video to see exactly how long certain inks take to dry inside of here. We won't do it for every single one, but we will start with this one. To do this, I'll set a timer for 10 seconds. It starts once I finish writing. The timer will go off, and I like to run my finger across it just to see what that's gonna look like. And as you can see, 10 seconds later, the ink is still very wet. This is a pen and ink combination with the broad nib plus this ink that has quite a long dry time. Even after 90 seconds, so a minute and a half, it still was a little bit wet. But what happens if we try the same exact ink with a more fine point pen? This is my Lamy All-Star. This is my very first fountain pen. It has an extra fine nib here at the top. It is so nice and fine tipped. How long will the ink take to dry with something as fine as this? So while there's a little bit of smearing, 30 seconds is all this one took to get to that fast drying. So it very much has to do with your pen and ink combo. Now the big reveal is, did this bleed through the page? And as you can see, it didn't bleed through. Even with the ink sitting on top and taking as long as it did, this is a super safe ink to use inside of your Archer and Olive notebook. You just have to be a little bit careful about how quickly you flip your page. As you saw when I showed you my full collection, there are a lot of different types of ink out there. One of my personal favorites, especially for bullet journals and writing quickly, as a lefty, all those things, is the Private Reserve Ink Ultra Black Fast Drying Ink. This is another pen in my collection. This is from Conklin. It's called the Herringbone. This is another broad nib pen, so we're going to try this one out, along with our quick drying ink to see exactly how fast it is. So fast drying ink plus this nib, completely dry in 90 seconds. So using something a little bit more fine like this glass dip pen, hopefully will do a lot quicker. I don't know that I'd say I'd travel with a glass dip pen. What's super cool about the glass pens is they have these really cool swirls that hold onto the ink, so you can dip it inside of any ink that you want, and you can write with it for quite a long time. This is a fine nibbed one here, so a lot different than the bold or the broad that we have on these other pens. So let's see how well the quick drying ink does on the Archer and Olive paper with a thinner nib. So a finer tip with this did a lot better, about 30 seconds worth of dry time. And my favorite part about glass tip pens Just have to whoosh them around in some water to totally clean it off. Some more tests, more pens, but how do we hold up? Still looking really good. But let's actually talk about inks that don't do great inside of the Arch and Olive notebooks. So I'm going to use 3 different pens here with this ink just to show you the variances in different types of nibs that you can use. The first is going to be a Murano glass dip pen that I have here. I also have my Kakamori steel nib dip pen. That one's super modern, does the same thing as glass pens, but it's steel. And the other is a very fine point calligraphy nib. And all of them are filled with the Conklin Antique Turquoise fountain pen ink. We're not talking about dry time here, friends. We're talking about the ghosting that you can start to see through this paper. This isn't considered bleed through. It didn't bleed onto the other side of the page, but the more ink that's going down with this ink specifically, the more it is saturated into the paper and coming through on the other side. The nibs this time put down even more ink, especially with that Kakamori one that laid down a whole bunch. The outcome of this caused feathering, which is kind of the blurring that you see around the letters, as well as bleed through onto the other page from where that C and that O were when that went down. But we're not seeing it with the very fine nib here. So in most cases, you maybe could use this pen instead of an extra fine pen inside of your bullet journal, but I don't think you could do very much more than that. So are there any inks that we can use with a larger nib that maybe aren't going to ghost or bleed through the page? A lot of that is going to rely on your pen, but it also has to do with the ink too. It's one of my favorite inks from Colorverse. It's called NGC 1850. It's named after a cluster of stars because it's a glistening ink. It's dark black, and I'm going to actually use this with a B1 calligraphy nib. I love this nib so much, but you need to have big handwriting to use it because it's a monoline. Because it's a monoline nib, our lesson here is that if you put down a lot of ink in any notebook, you're going to get a little bit of ghosting or potential bleed through. And even with a lot here, it's not as bad as we have it up here. It works pretty well, and you don't see it at all anywhere that we wrote it with a regular pen. And we even wrote it with a B3 nib, which is smaller than this one here, with no ghosting or bleed through whatsoever. We've gone through a lot here so far, talking about different sizes of your nibs plus ink and seeing what the outcomes are. Different inks are more wet, therefore bleed through the page, versus something that might be a little bit drier, but still is going to react if you put a lot of it on top of the paper. Over on the right-hand side of the paper, I'm going to try all my different pens with the rest of the inks that I brought out, and then we can quickly go over and talk about which inks do well, depending on the size, and which ones we can recommend to continue to use or try to use inside of Arch and Olive notebooks. Not every ink in my collection, but it's pretty darn close. We use so many different ones inside of here. We got dark colors, we have light colors, we have this really awesome platinum citrus black, which starts out yellow and then slowly gets a bit darker over time, which is super cool. One of my favorites is the crystal blue legacy from Ferris Wheel Press. Has just a little tiny bit of shimmer to it, but nothing like overdone, which I still like a lot in that blue color. And we've tried so many different sizes. Now the important part is that flip over to see how everything did. There's only a handful of inks that ghosted through here a little bit. Some of these big ones on here, the Poison Envy, I did in that big, huge B1 nib, as you can see. But what's so cool about this Poison Envy is that there's a sheen and a sparkle and the super dark color, which are really nice. And even with that larger nib, we only got a little tiny little bit of that bleed through there where it went on heavier as we started to write it. But all of these did fantastic on the page. I think where you see a lot of the heavier ink ghosting and some of that bleed through here all has to do where I'm using a really big like B1 nib on here, which you wouldn't always do. Most of the time that ink is going to be inside of a pen. That pen is going to be extra fine or maybe even a little bit thicker, but you just have to think about what pen is going to be putting down a lot of ink, and is that going to be the right ink and the right pen for your notebook. The only way to truly know is to try. Get a pen. fill it up with different types of ink, right inside of your notebook. If you get ghosting, make a note of it somewhere that it maybe isn't the best pen for you to use inside of your notebook. You especially want to mark that when you have inks that are ghosting or starting to bleed through the page with the finer tip pens. It's one thing to be like, let me throw the biggest nib that I have at my notebook and, oh, if it bleeds through, it's no good. That's not how it works. Reality is that some inks are just better than others. They work better on different types of paper. But to answer our question, can you use fountain pen inks inside of your Archer and Olive notebooks? Absolutely can, 100%. I highly recommend it. Just make sure that you have good inks, not overly wet, and work with pens that are on that extra fine or fine. At the most, a medium nib, I think, is what you would want to go inside of an Archer and Olive notebook. But of course, it's completely up to you. If you don't mind a little bit of ghosting on your pages or a little dot of bleed through if there's extra ink, then you have nothing to worry about. Go crazy, have fun inside of your Archer and Olive notebook, as we will continue to do this year.